me introduce myself. My name is Ann Hanigan Kotz, and I live in Adel. My husband and I are retired teachers. I am originally from Denison.
Oh.
Highway 30, home of Donna Reed, right? Okay, somewhere famous. And so I'm a Western Iowa girl, which is why the book is set in Western Iowa. And I was a high school English teacher at Waukee for 30 years. I taught for 33 years total. And honestly, most English teachers secretly want to write a book. We just don't talk about it because you just never know whether you're going to get that done. My last year of teaching, that's when I started the book. And for a long time, I just didn't know what I wanted to write about. When I was in college, I went to the University of Northern Iowa.
Yeah.
Go Panthers, right? I wanted to be a history teacher. That's my first passion. In 1988, if you couldn't coach a sport, you couldn't be a history teacher. Am I right or am I right? Yes, I am right. So I went to my second I love to read. You know, and I was that kid in the Carnegie Library with all the books, tried to check out as many as I could. And so that's why I became an English teacher. So, like I said, my last year of teaching, which was 3 years ago, I've been retired now, I was in Denison with my mom. And Hanigan, oh, that's an Irish name if there ever was one, right? My mom's not Irish, she's Norwegian. And Mom always reminded us, you know, you're Norwegian too. And so Mom was sharing her genealogy with me. She's done the genealogy, not me. And she was telling me about Christopher and Karoline Olsen, my great-great-grandparents. Their names are actually pronounced Karolina, because in Norwegian the E is pronounced as an A, and Christopher. Christopher. So she was telling me about these two grandparents of mine. My mom didn't really even know either one of those people. They had already passed by the time she was a little girl. But the story about Christopher dying in 1905 at 40 years old, away from home, and his body had to be carried back by his own wife. That was the story that she told me. And I said to my mom, can you imagine, Mom? She had all these kids, she had a farm, and she was on her own. I said, can you imagine what she must have thought about on that several-day trip home with his body with her? And I did imagine. I imagined a lot. And that's when I started the book. And I started to write that book around December. Up in my office at night by myself, I told not a single soul that I was writing that book. Not even my husband knew I was writing the book because I didn't know if I could do it. I really started to write the book because I just wanted to see if I could do it. And I really thought it probably won't happen. And so I didn't want to tell anybody because I really didn't want people asking me, how's it going? It's kind of like dieting. I don't tell people when I'm dieting because I don't need them looking at the food I'm eating or looking at me to see if I've gotten any thinner. So I finished the book in about 6 months, and I really didn't know what to do with it. I gave it to a colleague of mine. She and I both taught advanced placement English, and she said, this is really good. I really like this. What are you going to do with it? I was like, oh. I had no illusions of being with a publishing company. I wasn't going to write any more books. This was it, one and done. It's dedicated to my mother, to show her, you know, I do have a huge interest in being Norwegian as well as being Irish. And I thought, okay, well, I'm just going to print this book. So I did my research. I found a self-publishing company, and I could print 50 books. I thought, one for me, one for my mom, and then now I've got 48 books that I need to somehow get rid of because I was picturing a box of books sitting in my basement and my husband going, and how much did you spend on that? So I ended up selling those remaining 48 books. In total, I sold 400 books. And I eventually, about a year after I wrote the book, then I got accepted into the Des Moines Book Fair. They accept so many self-published authors. I knew someone who knew someone, so wasn't that impressive. You get a table for an hour and a half. It was $50. Somebody has been ahead of you on that table, somebody's bringing their stuff in behind you, and you have an hour and a half to sell. So super excited. Lanyard on, outfit, table decorated, and my time slot, my hour and a half, was the same time that the keynote speaker was at the Des Moines Book Fair. It was the gal who wrote the book Maid, M-A-I-D. Even I wanted to see her. But she speaks away from all of the vendor tables, and so there wasn't anybody on the floor buying books when I was selling. I sold 2 books, $2. But there was another author there that I know. His name is Joe LaValle, and he writes crime fiction. Yeah, if you heard of Joe. Well, I knew Joe, not because he was an author, but because he's a dad. Joe has 6 children, and they live in Waukee, and I taught 5 of his 6 children. So I went and talked to Joe about his publishing company, and yeah, he was at their table. So I gave them one of my books and said, you know, I'd be interested. And I thought, well, you know, I did $50, I did what I could. I got a call from them in 2 weeks. They wanted to sign me on with my book. And so it used to be called The Longest Journey. It had a cemetery on the front of it, the cemetery where they're all buried. And so he said, one, I want to change the title of the book. It's already been used, and it was used all the way back in like the 1860s, but he didn't want to reuse the title. So that's why it's called what it is. And then he said to me, we have to change the cover. He said, cemeteries don't sell books. And I'm like, all right, well, I kind of think they're cool, but okay. So that's where I started. And, you know, I have a book club as well, and I actually gave the book to my book club before I even published it. And they were like, we love this, but what happens now? And I said, you have to write another book. You have to tell us what happens to Karoline, what happens to those children. And I'm like, oh, okay, I think I got a few more. I had, you know, a couple more stories. Tingvald is my great-grandfather. So that character in the book is mine. And so I had some more stories from him. My mother knew her grandfather and had the stories. So basically, I did the research for book 2, which takes place from 1905 to 1933. And I was really interested. Remember, I love history, especially American history. I wanted to know what the pandemic, the 1918 flu, you've got World War I, Depression, Prohibition, and suffrage. Those were the 5 major, that's a lot that went on during that time period. I studied them in American history just like you did, but nobody ever said what it looked like in Iowa. That's what I wanted to know. How did the people of Iowa deal with all their men going off to war? Did the women of Iowa participate in suffrage? Those were the things that I was interested in. So I did the research and basically took her 6 children and wrote plot lines for every single one of them and finished hers out. And then the base of it is all during that time period, so you find out what Iowa was like during that time period. There is a book 3. I've had people read book 2, and I said, what do you think the 3rd book is? And they're like, I don't know, because you didn't leave us at a cliffhanger this time. I'm like, okay, well, you'll see. It's written. It will not be out until 2025, though. I have a different book coming out this fall that's not part of the Olsen journey, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So I thought I would read a part of, usually I do chapter 1 from Karoline, but so many of you already read that chapter, so I'll just take a little bit out of the new book. Remember at the end of the book, she's pregnant? The baby's name is Floyd. Iowa's conservative nature had started at its inception in 1847, the legislature restricting alcohol through licensing. In 1882, it went a step further and passed a total prohibition law, which was later struck down by the Iowa Supreme Court, but then reinstated the following year with the power of prohibition in the hands of each county. Its women, Annie Wittenmeyer and Ida B. Wise, fought tirelessly to keep the state's residents from imbibing the evil drink. Its famous son, Billy Sunday of Nevada, railed against the ills of alcohol from his pulpit. Now rumors of prohibition again drifted through Iowa. The state legislature, a conservative group of men, had been discussing making alcohol illegal statewide. Each year the topic came up but didn't make it through funnel week. This year, however, those gentlemen guaranteed their constituents they would make sure it not only made it through funnel week, but would be passed in both houses. Many of them ran on the Prohibition platform. They didn't dare go back on their word, or their seat in state government would be filled by another man's backside the next time they came up for election. Governor George Clark guaranteed he would sign it. Prohibition, their panacea for the ills of society, was the most important issue of the 1915 Iowa legislative session. Floyd overheard his brothers talking about its definite passage and saw his chance of visiting a saloon slipping away. He saw the saloon as the icon of manhood. Men standing up to a bar, drinking and discussing the day's business, was the modern day Camelot. He had been waiting for his 16th birthday, 4 years away, hoping he would look old enough for the bartender to consider him close enough. If the law passed, Floyd would never put his belly up to the bar. There would be no chance for any man to drink. Floyd always followed the policy of doing and then asking for forgiveness, often forgetting the forgiveness part. He just wanted to see the inside of the saloon and perhaps get a drink of beer. Even if the bartender wouldn't serve him, surely some man would pity him and give him a few sips. He waited until his mother needed to go to town for some shopping. Uncharacteristically, he volunteered to go with her. Once in town, Floyd lied to his mother, telling her he wanted to do some looking on his own. The holidays were coming closer, and he had some shopping to do. As soon as she entered the butcher's shop, he headed toward the Soldier Saloon. Stepping inside, Floyd's eyes drank in his surroundings. The interior was dim, hiding the Christian drinkers in the corner. On his left, running along a good portion of the wall, stood a solid bar and a matching back bar, each made of oak. For the grown men, the serving bar hit the bottom of their ribs, allowing them to rest their elbows. But for Floyd, if he stood at the bar, he would just be able to put his chin on the wood. A brass footrail ran along the bottom of the bar, shined each week by the owner. Floyd looked at an ornate mirror decorating the back bar, reflecting the multicolored bottles of liquor lining the shelves. Signs, photos, and relics covered the walls. The owner, an avid hunter, proudly displayed his kills. Heads of bear, deer, and elk, an old horse collar from his farming days hung directly in the center of the back bar. A very unusual sign: all gamblers and fancy women must sign up with the captain before the boat leaves for New Orleans, hung off to the side of the bar. Floyd didn't understand it, but he thought there must be something entertaining about its content. Floyd stood inside the entrance of the bar, just looking at all there was to see, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. No one paid attention to him. The patrons, lined up at the bar like birds on a fence, were discussing life with one another. Others, sitting at tables, were drinking alone and minding their own business. The bartender didn't see Floyd for a few minutes, but he eventually looked toward the door. "Hey, kid, you can't be in here. Where's your father? If he's in here, you'll still need to leave." The patrons, hearing the bartender, looked over at Floyd. One of them said, "That's the Olsen kid. He doesn't have a father. Just leave him alone, Clint. He's not hurting nobody. I'll buy him a Coca-Cola." "Art, mind your own drinking. He's not to be in here. If the boss sees him drinking anything in here, I'll lose my job." Floyd stood still, waiting to see which side would win. "Hey, you," another patron yelled over to him. "What you doing in here? You know this ain't for kids." With nothing to lose, Floyd decided to apply his charm. "I want the same as you all. A man just wants a drink once in a while." The bar crowd broke out into laughter. Even the bartender showed a smirk with Floyd's clever comeback. "How about one of you gents let me have a little beer before none of us can gather around here to drink together again?" Floyd asked. His reference to the impending prohibition law set off the men. Angry words and curses for the legislators erupted from several of them. What would become of their saloon? Wasn't a man old enough to make his decision about what went into his body? Why did these legislators have the right to tell him how to live his life? Floyd stood, listening to their arguments. Even without a drink, he felt like he was one of them. So Floyd's a little bit of a naughty boy. Well, so today, being a historical fiction writer, I do a lot of research. In fact, that's probably one of my favorite things. Generally, I research before I write. This one kind of went hand in hand because a lot of times history stories are way better than I can come up with. I'm always like, oh my gosh, are you kidding me? So let me tell you a little bit about Norway. Any of you Norwegian, by the way? look at all of you, my people. Other Scandinavians in here? Swedish, Danish, okay, yeah, good. Well, if you didn't know, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark used to have the same king. Okay, sometimes they were ruled by a Danish king, sometimes it was Norwegian, and it went that way for a really long time, which kind of put their language together, the Scandinavian language. That's why Scandinavians have a lot of the same cultural traits, because they all kind of used to be one people. But eventually, Sweden was the first one to drop off and said, you know what, we want to become our own country, our own king. And Norway and Denmark stayed together for a really long time. Actually, it was until 1915. Norway went through bad economic times, and Denmark said, we need to talk. It is you, not us. You need to go. So they dropped Norway. Norway has their Independence Day coming up, May 17th, Sitten Mai. And so that is one thing that is important to know about Norway. If you are not Scandinavian, or even if you are and you're not sure about this, how the Scandinavians came up with their last name. Father's first name added with son or daughter. And so you still have, you'll see some people with daughter, D-A-T-T-E-R, which I think is really cool. But the sons are what mostly. And so if you look at the book, and Karoline Olsen is S-E-N. And the Norwegians are like, oh, you spelled it wrong. No, I did not. I actually did not. When the Norwegians came over, it was originally spelled S-E-N. Their grave marker in the soldier cemetery is O-L-S-E-N. But so did the Danes spell it S-E-N. And the reason that they did is because in the Scandinavian language, the word son is sen. So Ole's sen, and there's, they have letters that we don't have in the English language, so they spelled it the way that it sounded. And so the Norwegians and the Danes all came over with S-E-N as the last name. Well, if you're in Norway, no one's mistaking you for a Dane. But when you come to America, pretty soon people are saying that you're Danish. And my grandpa Olsen was very adamant, we are not Danish, we are Norwegian. And so the second generation changed the name to S-O-N. So in book 2, you'll see Karoline Olsen spells it S-E-N and her children spell it S-O-N. The second generation did it to distinguish themselves from the Danes. And so my grandpa Olsen, it's all about S-O-N. He would just die if he saw a name on that. Another thing about Norway that surprised me is that Norway was number 2 country in terms of percentage of people that immigrated. Ireland is number 1, yeah, that makes sense to us. But it surprised me that Norway was number 2. More people have immigrated from Norway than are in Norway. Yes. Only 3% of Norway's land is tillable. Only 3%, that means only 3% of their population are farmers. So while my family came and farmed, there were a lot of families that were not farmers. They were fishermen, they were loggers, they were in the military. Another thing that is specific to this book is that if you are the first son, you are the one who inherits. And that's not just, that's other Scandinavian countries, it's even other countries out there. But if you're number 2 son or number 3 son, you're not on your own. You need to figure out what you're gonna do. So the immigration cities in Norway all sit in the south. Okay, so you have Stavanger is one of them, Bergen is one of them. My family came from Christiania. Christiania no longer exists. It is now called Oslo. It was called Christiania because it was named after King Christian, who was a Danish king. And when they broke up with us, we had tender hurt feelings, and so we got rid of Christiana. And I did the research on why Oslo, and it was just an area that was named that close to the city, and so they took that name. So Norwegians, Scandinavians do not use the letter C, by the way. They only use the letter K or S. So if you were going to immigrate, you had to make it to one of those southern cities. Now I want you to think about you and your family. You've decided you're going to immigrate to America or Canada. You would have had to travel first to one of those cities. Now, my family, lucky, they were already in a port city. But it might take you up to 2 weeks to travel to one of those cities. You need food, lodging, and you're burning through money with your children. Now, Norwegians did not have large families in Norway, just because of land mass, job opportunities. Once you get to the city, there's no guarantee that the ship is ready to go. So you might have to get a boarding house, and you might have to stay there for another 2 weeks before the ship actually sets sail. Even though they had a sail date, that didn't mean they left the sail date, because a lot of times the ships had to be repaired. So, why did the Norwegians leave? And I mean, again, number 2 in percentage of population. So there were one, because the second or third boy decided, I have no future here. They did go through poor economic times, just like any other country. They also, some of them had religious discrimination, which I don't think of when I think of Norway. You think of that for the English in this country, but they too had religious discrimination, and I'm going to come back around on that again. There was really no single reason why so many Norwegians immigrated, but something else that I read said, they are adventurous people because they were Vikings. And the Vikings were all about getting out, going to see what's going on. So how did they find out about America? And they spell America with a K, by the way. 1, letters. So people who came over here originally wrote letters home. Those letters were passed around whole families, sometimes entire villages, and sometimes whole villages left together. By the time the letter got to the last person, it was almost unreadable. Some immigrants came over here and then decided to go home again. And so they came and they talked about what America was like. There were also books written in the Norwegian language in America that made it over to Norway. But the big one was Norwegian newspapers. There were over 50 language Norwegian newspapers in the United States. The number 1 Norwegian newspaper with the largest readership, the Bastion, out of Decorah, Iowa. If you've been up there, you know there's a full of Norwegians up there. They also had state agencies that recruited for people to come to America. I'm going to come back around on that again when I talk about Iowa specifically. So the first Norwegians that came to America were called the sloopers. Anybody ever heard of the sloopers before? Oh, my Norwegians don't know about this. Well, let me give you a little more history. Between 1807 and 1814 were the Napoleonic Wars. And at that time, Norway had a Danish king, and he supported Napoleon. So he sent troops to go fight for Napoleon, some of them being from Stavanger, Norway. Well, those troops were captured by the enemies, and some of those enemies were British. And they took those Norwegians over to England as prisoners. Some of them were hurt and they went to hospitals. While they were in the hospital, they were taken care of by Quakers. And they decided, that Quaker sounds pretty darn good. They don't like to fight in wars. And so they came back to Norway after the war, and they said, well, most people in Norway are Lutheran. That's the prominent religion. Well, they came back and they said, we're not Lutheran anymore. And so one, we're not fighting any more of your wars. We're also not baptizing our babies. Well, the Lutheran Church was a little bit of a government entity at that time, and the Lutheran Church said, oh, no, you will. You'll do what we tell you to do. And so that's why they ended up leaving. because they were persecuted, they were threatened by the government. And so they decided, you know what, we should probably go to America. And they think they found out about America from the Quakers, because some of them had actually been to America during the Revolutionary War. So they sent a guy out there. Norwegians are not people that just willy-nilly do things. They're very careful people. And so they sent this guy, his name was Clang Pearson. And they said, Clang, go over to America and go check it out for us before we all emigrate. And he did. And he came back, and in the Norwegian way, he said, yeah, it's good. So there were a small group, and this was in 1825, so we're actually coming up on the 200-year anniversary. They bought a sloop. A sloop is not a passenger ship. To give you an idea of what a sloop looks like, it is 54 foot long, 16 foot wide. 54 foot long, 16 foot wide. It can carry a burden of 18,500 pounds. Okay? So they bought the sloop, and then they outfitted it so that they could take it across the Atlantic and go to America. They left with 52 people, and they had a huge load of iron with them. The iron was to sell when they got into America. That ship was sitting really low in the water. 52 people on a ship that was 52 feet and it was 16 foot wide. You had hardly your little tiny space. So they went from they went from Norway down to England. And they think they went to England because they visited their friends, the Quakers. And then they went from England to Madeira, which is off the coast of Portugal. And I thought, now why would they go to Madeira? But I found out a lot later on that they actually, that's where ships went. That was very common. They loaded up on supplies, and then you can see it straight across from New York City. So then they took off. So 52 people on this little tiny sloop, and they made it to America. They pulled into the New York City port, and they were immediately arrested and put in jail. They had violated the Passenger Act. So the United States had already started to get immigrants coming in, and because immigration was a business, and it was a lucrative business, ship owners and captains were overloading the ships with passengers, which was very dangerous. So the United States, the only country, enacted the Passenger Act, which said, for every ton that you can hold, X number of passengers. And if you go over, you, the captain, will be fined for every single person over what you should be hauling. Well, that sloop was way heavy. Oh, and by the way, remember they started with 52? They ended up with 53. Can you imagine having a baby thing? Horrible. So they put him in jail because they had violated the Passenger Act, but eventually they were released from jail. They were not trying to make a profit off of it, and they were pardoned by President John Quincy Adams. And they settled in Orleans County in New York, but they were not the first Norwegian to settle in Orleans County in New York. Leif Erikson settled in Orleans County in New York. Eventually, a lot of them, they had children. They also moved out of Orleans County, and some of them ended up in Illinois. They were working on the I&M Canal. So let's talk about sail ships, because only 53 people came over on that sloop. There's a lady in Jefferson who actually is a descendant of a slooper. The Norwegians are planning to outfit another sloop and sail it across to America in 25. And they're trying to get people in Norway who were descendants of the sloopers, they're trying to get them to go on the ship. This lady in Jefferson said, my brother or cousin or something, she was like, he's not wanting to go. I was like, I wouldn't either. So a lot of people came over on sail ships. Sail ships were cheaper than steam, and this would have been prior to the Civil War. The Civil War was kind of the change. A lot of them were called packet ships, so they carried cargo with them along with passengers. It took anywhere from 6 to 14 weeks on those ships, because what did they need? They needed wind. You could sit in the Atlantic Ocean for weeks at a time, drinking your water, eating your food. It cost anywhere from $25 to $38 for passage. You had to load your own possessions, and a lot of those ships made you bring your own food. Well, you didn't have experience. You'd never sailed on a ship before. You had no idea how much you were supposed to bring. So people starved on those ships. The conditions were terrible on those ships. So besides starving, they had extremely poor drinking water. So they would fill casks with water, fresh water, before they left. After 14 weeks sitting in that barrel, it's a little nasty. They had very stale air down in the holds of the ships. When bad weather came, they put them down in the hold and they shut it, and you could be down there for several days, and it was overcrowded. They had disease on those ships, cholera and typhus. So cholera, I was like, yeah, I know about cholera, but I don't really know how you get typhus. Typhus comes from body lice. It's the fecal matter of body lice, and it's so fine that it goes out into the air and you breathe it in. So some of those people that stayed in boarding houses and they were like packed in, you didn't get your own little room for your family, you were in a lot of people, they spread body lice. The ship spread body lice. Well, my people did not come on a sail ship, thank goodness. They came on steam, which was used after the 1850s. It cut the time in half. So Tingvoll is named, as you know, after the Thingvalla. So I found the ship scheduled, the Thingvalla. So the Thingvalla was a shipping line, and the Thingvalla itself was their maiden ship, their best ship. It went from Oslo to New York City and back every 2 weeks. It took 2 weeks to get over and 2 weeks to get back. So they would haul passengers over and they would bring supplies back. And they were hauling as many immigrants as they could at that time. So I don't know what ship they originally came over. I only know what ship she went back on when she had the baby, because of the fact that he was named Tingvoll. A lot of the Scandinavians came through Canada, because the shorter the passage, the cheaper the ticket. And so they came in through Halifax, and they were on the Lawrence River. So the Lawrence River cuts right across, right? And that was a way for them to get further into Canada. They also came into Quebec. They came in through America, which was more expensive, and it was a longer passage. New York, Boston, Falls River, and Philadelphia were the big ports on the East Coast. But New Orleans was also a port that they used, and that was the one that surprised me. I'm like, why would you go all the way down? Well, what sits from the ocean all the way up to Iowa? The Mississippi River. So some of the immigrants came along with the supplies, so they were bringing supplies to the Midwest. They didn't have trains back then. The trains ran only up and down the East Coast. They never came into the Midwest. So the only way you could bring supplies into the Midwest was up the Mississippi River. So my people did not come into Ellis Island. Have any of you been to Ellis Island? It's a phenomenal place to go visit. Well, I just had a lady last week. She said, she said, when I went to Ellis Island, they couldn't find my people. Well, that's because Ellis Island wasn't in existence at that time. Castle Garden, 1855 to 1890. So prior to Castle Garden opening, if you were an immigrant, you pulled into the New York City port and you unloaded your stuff, and then it was like, see ya. You were just out there in New York City. You didn't speak the language, a lot of them. You didn't know anything about where you were. And there were bad people that were in New York City, ruffians and scalawags. And so they would prey on immigrants, steal their money right off of them, pickpockets. Some of them would sell them passage tickets, like train tickets, that didn't exist. They would send them to boarding houses that actually were waiting for them to steal all of their stuff and their money. And so this was a horrible experience for immigrants coming into New York City. So a New York City official said, we need to do something about this, these poor people. And Castle Garden was a former military fort built on an artificial island. It is now Battery Park in New York City. And so Castle Garden was a welcoming center. It was very different than Ellis Island, because at that time there weren't so many immigrants coming in that we were starting to feel overwhelmed. So when you came into Castle Garden, they offered you a way to bathe, which would have been very welcome. They offered you food. They said, do you have any mail? Because if you do, we have it for you and we'll give it to you. Let me tell you about the train passage and how you can get where you want to go. Oh, here's a list of reputable jobs that you can apply for. It was a welcome center. It was very nice. 1855 to 1890. Then they opened Ellis Island, 1892 to 1954. And Ellis Island, the last ships came in the 1920s, like 1923, I think was the last one. Ellis Island was more about, do you have a plan? You're not just coming here and going out into the world. We need to know if you have a plan. Ellis Island was also concerned about disease. So they sent doctors on the ships prior to, and they sorted them off even before they got to Ellis Island and dumped them off on another island. They would watch you walk up the stairs, and if you looked like you were feeble, they marked you with a chalk mark on your back, and then you had to go and you had to go to a doctor. You had to fill out a form before you left with questions. What is your spouse's name? Where are you from? What are your parents' names? And that went with you. And then Ellis Island asked you the same questions. They wanted to make sure that you weren't switching people out, or you had made up information and now you just couldn't remember what you told them. They did not change names at Ellis Island, and Ellis Island will tell you that, right? Think about this. There was no government documentation in the United States at that time. You could be anybody you wanted to be. Not until Social Security came along were you an official person in the United States. Birth certificates were not a state or a government thing. They were a church thing. So that's why people's names got changed. Spelling, people couldn't read. So nearly 12 million immigrants went through Ellis Island.
Would you tell
Yeah.
if the child was sick, the mother had to go back to the country they came from?
Yeah, some children came over by themselves. And if you were under 16, they held you. And if you were sick, you were held in special dorms. That was the research I did for another book that I've been working on. So, yeah, it was quite a deal getting through
But most of them followed relatives.
Yeah, they did. They did. But, you know, a lot of families like the Irish, they sent over one child. We need money, send it back, and we'll bring another one over. So you did have a lot of them that came by themselves. A lot of women came by themselves, especially Irish women.
Usually
Domestic.
it was the father and the oldest came over
Yep.
first.
Work and send passage.
Got
Yeah.
established.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Well, once you got to New York City and you're like, you know what, I want to go to this state I've heard of, it's called Iowa. How do I get there? Well, there were no trains going to Iowa. The train system was only in the East Coast, and it was mostly up and down, and it was done by the robber barons for their own profits. But what you could do is from New York City, you could take a train up to the Erie Canal, which was dug by the Irish, by the way. You take it over to Lake Michigan. You take a boat down Lake Michigan, and then you can take the I&M Canal, which was also dug by the Irish, and that could get you onto the Illinois River, onto the Mississippi River. But once you got to Iowa, then you had to take covered wagon or whatever you could get a hold of, because there were no trains that ran all the way through Iowa. So when you got to New York City, if you were like, you know what, I want a farm. Well, not here. You're going to have to go to the Midwest because we have no farmland here. It cost you $14 to take a boat from Milwaukee to Chicago. In the 1850s, they started train passage. Again, Iowa took longer for train passage. One of the things that I learned about train passage that kind of surprised me, I knew that trains were like first class, second class. That makes sense to me. I didn't know that there was something called an immigrant class. If you were fresh off the boat, and I don't care where you came from, if you were fresh off the boat, you had to sit in immigrant class. You could not sit with everybody else. If you were lucky, they actually had a train car with seats on it. If the train was full, you went into a boxcar like cattle, and they shut the door. And you would think, now these people were immigrants themselves. Why would they do something like this? Disease. They had been on those boats. They were terrified of disease, and they didn't want to sit next to an immigrant who had just come off the boats. So immigration from Norway, the waves were in the 1850s, and then 1880 to 1893, and 1900 to 1910. So to give you some idea of how fast the Norwegians came over, in 1850 there were 13,000 Norwegians in America. 1865, 80,000. 1910 there were 1 million Norwegians in America. So we came hard. So Iowa specifically recruited Scandinavians into the country. There were certain groups of people. So Iowa had, new in their stateship, and they wanted more people for a better economy. And so they decided, we should probably recruit some of these people. We want the Scandinavians. We want the Germans. We don't want Italians. Anybody who was more Southern, they didn't want those people. So in 1860, they appointed a commissioner, and he went to New York City. And his job was to talk to them when they got off the boats and tell them about the wonderful things of Iowa. Come to Iowa. So when he went to the Scandinavians and he said, come to Iowa, they said, oh, absolutely not. Because Minnesota had already had a person doing this, and that person didn't stay in New York. That person went to Norway and talked to them before they got on the boats. And he said, you definitely don't want to go to Iowa. It is incredibly hot. You will hate the climate. You can't grow anything. It's just like a furnace in Iowa. That's what they believed. So that did not work. So he came back to Iowa and he said, look, day late and a dollar short. We can't try and get them in New York City. We got to go over to where they are. So in 1870, the Iowa legislature appointed a board of immigration, and they had a couple of men for the Scandinavian countries, some for the German countries. They need to speak the language, right? So they made this pamphlet, and it was called Iowa, the Home for Immigrants. And they printed them in the language. Well, they had 6,000 of them for the Norwegian, Scandinavian countries. And these two guys, Martin Clausen and Theodore Hundby, they were the ones who were supposed to go to Scandinavia. So they had their brochures, and they had to go through Chicago. And they were in Chicago getting ready to leave, and the Great Chicago Fire broke out. It burned up all of their pamphlets. So they didn't have anything to pass out when they got over to Norway. And so they decided that they were going to take some of the parts of the pamphlet, and they published it in leading Norwegian journals. In 1870, there was a governor's convention of the Midwestern governors got together, and they were like, okay, Nebraska, Illinois, we need to get these people because we need more population. Well, they spent 3 years talking about how we need to get more people, and then they never put any money to it, so that idea fell through. During that time period, Iowa was a terrible place to come to. It had a ton of wet years, so the crops failed. And they also had grasshoppers, and so the crops were eaten if they did grow the crops. The prices were low, and there was a problem starting with immigration. People in Iowa didn't want any more immigrants coming into Iowa. About that time also, prohibition, the idea of prohibition had started to go through. And these Irish and German drinkers were coming into the state, and we don't want any more of their kind here anyway. So there was a lot of anti-immigration sentiment in Iowa. So as much as Iowa tried to bring all these people in, I mean, basically they came naturally. And a lot of them had already settled in another state, and they ended up coming into Iowa from another state. So the first Norwegians into Iowa came in 1830, and they came into Lee County, which is down by Keokuk. Okay? Now, a lot of the Norwegians, when they came into Canada, they did the same thing. They came through the Lawrence River, they went down through Lake Michigan, and if I could show you the map, the Norwegians and Scandinavians settled across all the top states. The Dakotas, Washington, you can just see the red all the way across. Well, when I think of Minnesota, besides mosquitoes, I think of water, fishing, trees, cold. It's Norway. Yeah, the northern states were very much to their liking because it was very much where they came from. So that's why most of the Norwegians are settled all up into those top states. But surprisingly, some of them came into Lee County. There were a group of Norwegians, they were called the Sugar Creek Colony. They came from all the same area. They had come down through the I&M Canal and they settled into Illinois. And they had propagated, more and more of them came, and soon they ran out of land. And so they sent this guy over to Iowa and they said, hey, go tell us what it's like. So he came into Lee County, into Keokuk, and he came back and he said, yes. So that's why they moved into Lee County. Eventually, they left Lee County. But basically, they settled, Clayton County was first. So in your northeast corner, and that's because Minnesota got full, Wisconsin got full, right? And they were looking for land, and they started to come down into Iowa. Clayton County was first, and then Fayette, and then Winneshiek County. So those were the three big Norwegian counties. By 1855, though, the immigration from the Norwegians into Clayton County completely stopped. The Germans had started to settle into Clayton County, and they didn't want to have anything to do with those Germans, so they quit immigrating to Clayton County. So once they got into Iowa, if you settled into eastern Iowa, they had to take down trees, right? So that was a problem. I always had the idea that like they took the trees out like we do today. They did not. They left the stumps in and they planted around the stumps. Would have been easier, right? But if you've ever been in eastern Iowa, there are rocks. You always have to pick up rocks before you can put your crops in. If they came into central Iowa or western Iowa, there weren't enough trees and they had sod houses. I also read, and I didn't know anything about prairie grass. It's not my thing. Prairie grass has roots on it that's as thick as a tree branch. So they had to plow with ox 3 times across before the soil was loose enough before they could plant it. Prairie fires were a problem in central and western Iowa. So talking about, I don't know if you all know where Soldier, Iowa is. If you looked at it on a map, do you know?
I have grandparents from Morgan.
Okay, there you go. The Danish town. Yeah, absolutely. So my people are from the Los Hills. Los, Les, Lus. There's 3 different ways you can pronounce it. Okay, so this is the counties I was talking about. Here's where they are. They're in Monona County. Whoops. Uh-oh. You saw it quick?
Yeah.
So they're in Monona County. And if had anybody been, besides Moorhead here, anybody been in the Los Hills? Okay, you know what it's like, right? This is what you farm. I asked the people in Soldier, why? Why did the Norwegians come here? Because most of them were up in northeast Iowa. And they said, well, it's because, they said they didn't know. I think what happened is that, again, you're coming out of the north, okay? You're really close to the river, right? So this is an easy way to get there. If you don't have any money and you want to buy farmland, you buy bad farmland because that's all you can afford. So the hills would have been cheap farmland, is my guess why they probably came into Soldier. And of course, a few land in Soldier and tell the rest. Because at one time, Soldier was nearly 100% Norwegian, and they didn't speak English. So this is why you have this pocket right here into Soldier. How do I go further down? Good. I don't want to touch anything because I'll end up wrecking something. Go down. We'll keep going down. So 1880s, Iowa was completely settled. We'll go down again. my assistant. Well, so these are the Olsens. And this is Tingvald Atlantis Olsen. It's not Atlantic because they spelled it with a C because that's the way that it's spelled, but they never pronounce it with a C. It was always an S. And he hated to be called Tingvald. He went by T.A.
Is this an actual picture?
This is an actual picture. And they are actually on the cover of book 2. We can go down again. I think I have. So yeah, this is, you read book 1 of the trilogy. It ends in 1905. She's walking home from the cemetery. Book 2, 1905, she's walking home from the cemetery. Literally picks up again. It ends in 1933. And then, as I said, Wayward Son is coming out in 2025. This is my next book that's coming out, Moonshine by Moonlight. Anyone ever heard of Templeton Rye Whiskey and the bootlegging in Carroll County? Well, I'm from Crawford, which is the adjacent county. I've known about that bootlegging since I was in high school. So I worked with 2 grandsons of bootleggers, and it's set in Carroll County, and basically I created characters and a storyline, but all of the how they made it, why they made it, when they made it, how they hid it, how they got it out of Iowa, how much they were making, is all the things that I found out. So I'll have a new library program that goes with that, and I was telling the librarian that I will have bottles of whiskey that go with the book. It's being made for the book.
Oh.
And I also can get bootleg whiskey. My brother-in-law knows a guy who knows that guy. so I'm gonna get the little communion cups, and you could like try a little bootleg whiskey, and then I'll do more research about it. So,
I've never heard that much.
questions that you have?
Is your mom still alive?
My mom is still alive. Yeah, she is. We just moved her to a facility. Yeah.
Is she still in Denison?
No, she just moved to Cedar Rapids.
Oh, okay.
Like literally 2 weeks ago, we just
Oh,
moved
okay,
her
okay.
to a senior living place in Cedar Rapids because my brother lives there. Yeah.
I have
Yes.
a question about Floyd.
Yes.
So that's who she was pregnant with at the end of the first book?
Goldbrun
And,
Floyd Olsen. Goldbrun, remember, was her dad's name.
oh, that was her dad's name, Goldberg.
Goldbrun was her dad's name, but he goes by Floyd.
So I had thought, oh, it's got to be either Olaf or Heinrich.
Correct. I
But
know.
it was Floyd.
I know. I knew you would think that. See how tricky I am? I'm like leading you this way, but then I go, no,
Yeah.
take it away from you.
Yeah, so that was from her father's side. Floyd?
Yes.
Okay.
So Floyd is, the book tells you it's a more modern name, but she names him Goldbrun after her father.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Karoline Olsen's her last name really was Olsen as a maiden name. So Karoline Olsen married Christopher Olsen, because Olsen is like Smith.
Yeah.
It's such a common Scandinavian
Because it
name.
was
Yeah.
Holy Son.
Holy Son, right. And I thought, well, I can't have characters with the same last name. It'll confuse people. So that's why I gave her a completely different last name. But yeah. Yep.
But got married to old son.
Yep.
Yeah.
Other questions?
So how long did they stay in Soldier, or is that part of the second book?
That's all in the second book. Yeah, I remember going to my great-grandfather Tingvald's house. Yeah, I mean, that was in the 1970s. He died like in, I don't know, 72 or something like that. And there were Olsens even after him because he had Tingvald's brothers, you know.
Because there were lots of Norwegian and Danish. Olsen's in
Yeah.
Moorhead and
Yep.
Pisgah and
Yeah,
all in that.
all in that area. And of course, they're not all related to each other.
No, and the ones I know were all Lutherans, so they were not.
Well, they were Lutheran. Yeah, I'm Catholic.
But I'm
My
saying at
my
that-
grandpa was
at that-
Catholic.
But they came from the north down.
Oh, that was your grandfather.
Tingvald's son was
Oh, okay.
Catholic.
Oh.
Uh-huh. It's in the book. You're like, somebody asked me that because they knew I was Catholic. I'm like, well, how are you Catholic? Isn't your mom Lutheran? I'm like, no, she's Catholic. Read the book, find out what happened.
There we go. That's it.
Anything else? Well, I have brought books with me to sell. So,
I just had one more question
Yeah,
about your mother.
sorry. Yep.
What motivated your mother to start doing family history?
genealogy?
Genealogy.
I have no idea. I don't know.
And when she first started, you didn't pay any attention to it?
Of course not. Of course not. I was in college at that time and spent a lot of time on it. And I frankly didn't care. It seems like you get more interested in your family history the older you get. So, yeah. Yep. And she's gone as far back as she can because she'd have to go to Norway and get help.
Yeah.
And mom's 89 right now, so that's not happening. And I have not been to Norway. That's on my list. It's on my list. I go to Ireland this summer, so.
Your book being historical fiction, what parts of it were not true? What
The only
go that direction rather than
you mean the family story of things?
Yeah.
The only things that were true was her going back in the ship and him dying. That was it. The rest of it,
You did?
I added it all.
So how long did it take her to make that trip? To pick up her husband?
The real, it was like 2 days. He was in Sioux City. But because I graduated from Cedar Falls, and that there's an ice house up in Cedar Falls that I just love, I was like, oh, I have to put the ice house in. Plus, I knew where to get ice. I was like, I know how to do this. And it drew the story out longer for me. I needed enough time for her to flash back. 2 days just didn't work.
It was kind of cool for me to read your book because even though I was born in Pocahontas, grew up in Lawrence for about 4 years, I lived in Cedar Falls for 8 years.
Yeah.
So we learned a little history about Cedar Falls. It was kind of cool that you put that in there.
Yeah. I've had people say,
Yeah.
I loved it because she went through my town.
Yeah.
I know where she is.
Yeah.
I recognize that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because and how many books have you read that have Iowa towns in them?
Yeah.
None. Des Moines, sometimes Des Moines shows up.
Yeah.
But generally, especially Western Iowa, that was my thing. I'm like, nobody ever writes about Western Iowa. And it's beautiful. I mean, I'm a Western Iowa girl. I mean, the flatness of where I live just kind of drives me crazy. Yeah.
She wrote about Spirit Lake and things. We go by Spirit Lake.
Have you ever heard of Ole's Robot? Giants in the Earth?
Read them all. I've read all of his books.
Those were so great.
Phenomenal.
I couldn't put that first book down.
I agree. It was phenomenal. In fact, I had planned to go ahead and read it again. I belong to the Daughters of Norway. It's a women's lodge. There's only one in Iowa. It's in Des Moines. And we're going to do book club with Scandinavian books, and that's the first one I'm recommending because it's phenomenal. Yeah.
It's a three-part
Yes.
book
Yes.
about
So what
one
was the
generation,
name
next
of it?
generation, and the third generation.
It's called Giants in the Earth by O.E. I'm sure the library probably has it. Yeah.
Or we can certainly get it for you if it's not on our shelves.
Yeah.
He was a professor at St. Olaf's in Minnesota.
Oh, he was. Yeah. It's been a long time.
If you go to Vermilion, on the back way into Vermilion, there's a historical marker for the Giants of the Earth from where.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
A big spot there where you can stop and
Wow. It's been a really long time since I've read it, but it stayed with me.
It's about how, 5-6 Norwegian families, they started out in Worthington and when they went to Garrison, South Dakota to settle. And their trials and tribulations. And
I just remember her crawling into her box, what she brought over with her,
oh, yeah.
and because the wind drove her crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, you heard some families bringing organs.
Oh, yeah.
You know.
I know. Yeah.
That was their most prized possession.
I
And they
know.
had to truck it out of the country, too, to
Yeah.
the ship.
I know. It's amazing what these people did. It's amazing. Well, I really thank you for your time today and coming out in bad weather too. Good for you. I looked at that and I was like, oh, they're not coming out in this. Thank you.
And she will be selling books, her second book and her first book, if you want to purchase
Yep.
that also. And she will sign them. So
Yes.
if you're interested in that, do that. Also, I just want to say for our next book club, if people are interested in picking up the book that we're doing for our next, It's Pineapple Street by Jenny Jackson, and it's kind of about a New York wealthy family, completely opposite from what we just read about, and kind of the connections that their younger children make with other people and their spouses and how they can deal with each other and the wealth gap. So anyways, that is April 22nd at 6:00 p.m. I do have those books at the front desk and we can assign them to you. So thank you, SMU, for being here.